Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining this McGraw-Hill education webinar by Dr. Jan Hasbrouck today on the topic of dyslexia. We're so glad you could join us. This session will be recorded and will be sent out to you later. Today joining us is Dr. Jan Hasbrouck. She's an educational consultant, author, and researcher working with schools in the U.S. and internationally. Dr. Hasbrouck worked as a reading specialist and coach for 15 years and later became a professor. She's the author and co-author of several books, and her research in reading fluency, academic assessment, and interventions, and coaching has been widely published. She continues to collaborate with researchers on projects related to assessment and intervention. I'd like now to turn it over to our session with Dr. Jan Hasbrouck. Jan?
Thank you, Lindsay, and welcome everyone to this session on dyslexia. I've titled this Understanding and Providing Instruction to Students with Dyslexia, which of course is a very ambitious topic for the period of time we have together, but I'm very glad to be able to do it. Dyslexia is on the minds of many people these days. It's certainly become a very hot topic in education, and I spent time this summer developing a book on dyslexia. It's not quite out yet, but what I'm going to present to you is a very condensed version of some of the biggest ideas that came out of this book. It will be called Conquering Dyslexia. So I'm anxious to share this information with you. So I'm glad that you're with us today. Let's start by talking about what we all understand dyslexia to be. And I put the question mark there because there are still a lot of misunderstandings or confusions about dyslexia. Certainly many of us have understand dyslexia to be problems with reversals. Children with dyslexia reverse their B's and D's, P's and Q's, those kinds of things. We've sometimes heard too that students with dyslexia, readers with dyslexia, the text moves around on the page while they're reading. That's part of what makes it so hard for them to read. There's also that issue of mirror writing. They see the word was and they call it saw because something is wrong with the vision in the way that they read. It may be that dyslexia is related to the eyes or vision somehow. These things that we've discussed kind of points that way. There's also been an understanding for a long time that there are more boys who have dyslexia than girls. And there is this notion of some people who work with children with dyslexia, because so much of the time these students are very bright and very capable and have strong language and reasoning skills. Sometimes they're quite exceptional in math. So really it just seems in their reading and writing and spelling that they just need to try a little harder. Well, I have learned, and I will share with you, that every one of these understandings, older understandings, has now been proven to be not true. Our newest understanding, and part of why many of us have been left confused, I think Mark Seidenberg in this new and important book called Language at the Speed of Sight kind of forgives us all about being confused about dyslexia. He says it's been confusing because the explanations continue to change. The research has advanced tremendously. And in the book that I wrote this summer, this was the body of research I had to look at. There is an amazing amount of research going on in the area of medicine, the neurology of dyslexia, actually looking in the brain, as well as eye researchers and others in the medical field. On the other side, psychology and education, we have been doing research in that area, in the area of dyslexia, for well over 100 years. But the research continues to advance. And one of the reasons it's advanced is because of technology, simply this amazing tools now that only very recently have allowed us to examine the functioning working brains of even young children, like this little girl. There is some research being done in Boston now, Dr. Nadine Gabb, who has grants to do research on infants. So the new technology is just astounding. And this magnetic source imaging, and I'll show you some pictures that have been derived from that research, has really completely transformed our understanding of dyslexia, deepened and confirmed some of the theories we had about dyslexia, but totally disproved others that we believed were true for good reason when we just watch students read. But we now know a lot of facts. So, and people are interpreting these facts differently. You may know the work of David Kilpatrick. He's written a couple of very influential books, and he's out on the speaker circuit a lot these days. And he wrote on a listserv, the Spell Talk listserv, which I highly recommend to you. If you are kind of a reading nerd, you really like to do a deep dive on reading, the Spell Talk listserv, it's a free professional forum. People just post their ideas and get into discussions, ask questions. I find it very valuable to me. I'm an active participant in Spell Talk. But in 2018, writing about dyslexia, Dave wrote this: the dyslexia refers to poor word-level reading despite adequate effort and opportunity. And then he goes on to say, that's it. Pretty simple. That's what dyslexia is. He goes on to say in that of course, it's more complicated than that, but basically his point is being, we thought it was lots of other things. We now know that if you have dyslexia, the biggest problem you're going to have is with word reading. That's the issue. But because of it, it is complex. The International Dyslexia Association came up with a definition that is probably the most widely used and certainly most widely referred to definition of dyslexia. And here we're going to go over it in the time we have today. But their definition starts with the idea that the fact, not the concept, not the belief, but the fact, we now know that dyslexia is a specific learning disability that is neurological in origin, meaning that you're born with it. It is heritable, it runs in families, it has a genetic component. Dyslexia, as David said, is characterized by difficulties with accurate and or fluent word recognition and poor spelling and decoding abilities. And these difficulties result from a deficit in the phonological component of language. Dyslexia is a language-based disorder, and it is an auditory disorder. Not the ability to hear, but the ability to process the auditory components of language. And it is often unexpected. People with very high IQs and high abilities can have dyslexia. Average to low skilled folks can have dyslexia too. It's totally unrelated to cognitive abilities. And it can appear even though effective classroom instruction has been provided. So from the research, the International Dyslexia Association, also called IDA, we can conclude that dyslexia is not a visual spatial issue like we thought it was for a long time. The research in the medical side that has focused on dyslexia says the research is not supporting eye exercises, behavioral vision therapy, tinted lenses for dyslexia. Now, it's important to point out that eye exercises and vision therapy and tinted lenses can have a role to help the sight and the vision and the processing, the reading of some people, but it is not at all related to dyslexia. All those things are helpful for disorders, eye disorders, vision disorders. We know dyslexia is not an eye disorder or a vision disorder. It can be helpful to think about this, that in general, when we try to separate the eyes from reading, in general, blind children learn to read with relative ease. Now, some children who are blind also have dyslexia, but blindness doesn't make reading difficult. However, being deaf or severely hearing impaired makes learning to read extremely difficult, even with early intervention and lots of good instruction. The most capable deaf readers are never highly proficient readers. Reading is all about the auditory aspect of processing language. So we know it's not a visual spatial issue. We know it varies in intensity and impact. You can have mild dyslexia, moderate to severe, very severe. It is genetic, as we talked about. This is one of the images that comes from those magnetic imaging machines, magnetic encephalography, or others, where we can non-invasively take pictures of active working brains. So these are two different children, two different 5-year-olds who are agreed to have their brains scanned while they're engaged, not in a reading task because they are not yet readers, but a language task, and watching how their brain is stimulated and activated with a language task. The student on the left, what we can see is the red, those red dots, that red activity indicates brain activity. And that student, when engaged in a language task, the left hemisphere is highly activated. That is a not at-risk brain. That is a normally functioning, typically developing brain. Language happens in our left hemisphere. So the student on the right is at risk because when we take an image of that child's brain doing exactly the same kind of task, that child's brain is trying to process language, auditory language, in his or her right hemisphere. That's not the hemisphere that was that we're born wired to process language, and we understand reading to be a language-based task. Marianne Wolf, if you study at all about dyslexia or read about dyslexia, she's one of our premier researchers in this field. In her most recent book, she makes the statement that human beings were never born to read. None of us have brains that are born ready to read. We are born ready, most of us. If we have a typically developing brain, we are neurotypical, as we say. Our brains are wired for language. But turning that language into the ability to read and write is not wired in. That has to happen through instruction. We've also learned that the way the brain becomes a reading brain is entirely different from the way the brain learns language. We are wired for speech. We are wired for language. And when we try to ask our brain to do this thing called reading, writing, spelling, we have to activate the brain in an entirely different way. And the way we learn that is completely different as well. So some more things we know about dyslexia: it can affect speaking because it is a language-based disorder, and some folks with dyslexia have difficulties processing language, storing words and language and concepts, and then accessing that language too. That can be another characteristic of dyslexia. There are often emotional consequences, a lack of confidence when students start to realize, and it happens very early on for many children in kindergarten or first grade, they realize that they're not learning to read and write and spell as easily and effortlessly as many of their peers. If you have worked with students with dyslexia, you have a child with dyslexia, you yourself have dyslexia, this is going to be very familiar to you, but one example of the emotional consequences of dyslexia is captured by this young man, Noah, who at the time he wrote this sample, I'm going to show you a piece of his writing. He was an 18-year-old high school senior who is dyslexic. He reads at about the 4th grade level. His spelling is even lower than that. And he, in his English, high school English class, every day they wrote in a journal. And he wrote this next page I'm going to share with you, and his mother saw it and brought it to us to share. The writing is kind of hard to read, and certainly on the screen it's difficult. His spelling is very poor, his handwriting is poor, so if you will bear with me, I'm going to read it to you and you can read along with me. Today I was so embarrassed in English that I never want to go to English class again. When you said you were going to pass out the paper back, and I knew it was going to be bad. I can't figure it out, but the loudest kid in the class always gets my paper. She makes fun of my spelling and calls my name out in front of the whole class. Then she keeps pointing out my misspelled words, and all the kids around her laugh and look at me. I'm going to skip to the bottom because we have limited time, but if you see down about 3 lines or 4 lines, he says, spelling and reading are my disabilities, and I get no help to get any better at it. The school doesn't help me, and that is why I hate school and all the kids who laugh at me. School just hurts me. This notion that we have an 18-year-old child who is bright, a bright kid, capable in many other things, but his dyslexia has never been fully addressed. And yeah, school hurts him. The very tragic and real emotional consequences of dyslexia that is diagnosed late, dyslexia that is not addressed through instruction has huge consequences, not only for the children, but the family. I wrote about that a bit in the book that I'm just finished this summer. The prevalence of dyslexia is unknown. That's why I put the question mark there. Among the experts working in dyslexia, there's not 100% agreement about that. One researcher is kind of by herself out there on this. Dr. Sally Shaywitz from Yale has for many years says that her data indicates about 20% of the population is dyslexic. Most people feel that that's a little bit high. Some people say it may be as small as 5%, but there's general consensus around practitioners as well as researchers that it is likely somewhere in the vicinity of 15, maybe 10 to 15% of children, people. You will have access to this lovely infographic developed by Nancy Young that shows very accurately research-based idea of prevalence of reading abilities across the population of children. So if we start at the top of this ladder, researchers have identified that approximately 5% of children seem to learn to read absolutely effortlessly. I mean, these are the children, you may have a child like this, you were maybe a child like this, somewhere around 3 or 4 years old, they just pick up books and start reading. And it's just kind of mind-boggling. The researchers call these precocious readers. Fascinating little brains that these kids have. The next group, in sort of light green, 35% approximately, of course, all these numbers are approximate. They are pretty precocious, but they don't learn to read without some instruction, but it doesn't take much. A little bit of instruction, a little bit of practice, a little bit of encouragement, they're off to the races. So that's about 40% of the population. And the majority of the population, somewhere around 40 to 50%, do benefit from instruction, code-based, meaning based on teaching the students phonics, explicit, systematic, sequential. We're going to talk more about that in this webinar. But the students we're focused on today are at the bottom, and you can see she put 10 to 15%. That's closer to the general agreement about dyslexia prevalence. They need the kind of explicit, systematic instruction that we will be talking about. It's essential for those students. And the earlier, the better. That's critically important too, because we now have systems and processes to identify students around 4 to 5 years old. We can start intervening with dyslexia very early. So returning to the IDA definition, some of the key words there. It's neurobiological. It has to do with word recognition. Spelling and decoding are often related, and the phonological component of language is where the problem is. The neurobiological, we've talked about that. You are born with dyslexia, and we can find it very early, even before reading starts. The accurate and fluent word recognition. This really, we've had theories about this for a long time. The simple view of reading, again, very well known in the reading field. I'm sure many of you have seen this before. The theory that now has, what would that be, 30, 40 years of evidence to confirm that this concept is true. This idea that you become a reader, that reading is, or RC, reading comprehension, is the product of decoding times language comprehension, basically decoding the ability to both decode and recognize words, sight words, and language comprehension, the ability to understand spoken language. And it's always represented as a product, not a sum, because of the contributions of both of the sides of this. If you have a strong or adequate decoding skill, but you have low language, you don't understand what you're reading. This would be a typical profile of children who are learning to speak English or learning to speak the language they're learning to read. Their decoding might be quite good, but they don't understand the language. Therefore, their reading comprehension is going to be affected. Our students with dyslexia are the opposite. They often have adequate to high language comprehension. Their difficulties, mild, moderate, severe difficulties, are on the D side of the equation, the decoding and word recognition. This is a different infographic, another famous one. We will make sure that you have access to this. Scarborough's rope infographic that basically represents the simple view of reading. She separated the language comprehension from the word recognition being the problem that most of our students with dyslexia bring to the situation. The phonological component of language we now know for certain is causal factor in dyslexia. And what we mean by that, there are two real components. When you look at the standards or any book on reading, they should talk about phonological awareness as the broader concept, general concept of sounds and rhythms of speech, whereas the phonemic awareness is more discrete and narrow. That has to do with the sounds and syllables in words and the ability of the brain to notice that there are individual sounds, identify ultimately, and manipulate them. And it's the brains of the students that we now call dyslexic that have difficulty, mild, moderate to severe difficulty with that phonemic awareness component. All states these days have identified some kind of standards that they want to work at. Many of the states, most of the states use some version of these standards that in kindergarten and first grade, we want to be sure that our students are recognizing rhyming words, which is a phonological skill, that they can segment and blend phonemes, blends, onsets. That's still in the phonemic, that moves us to the phonemic side, and ultimately helping those brains be able to do a more sophisticated manipulation of language. And this is all auditory, being able to hear sounds and change the sound. For instance, if we asked a student to take the word dog and then take the g away and put a t in there and make a new sound, dot, helping students do that. It sounds odd and strange, but it's the ability of the brain to do that kind of auditory task that then lends itself to skillful reading. We also want students to be able to hear, distinguish, identify long and short vowels. And this is all auditory. When we're talking about phonological or phonemic awareness, we could do all of this in a pitch dark room. Kids are blindfolded. We can still practice these skills. I'm not recommending that, but we don't need our eyes to do these auditory tasks. So let's talk for the remainder of our time to teach, how to teach these students. I'm not talking about the assessment piece today, but certainly the assessment would include assessments of the language side of things and the phonological awareness side of things. But once we've identified a student who is having some difficulty with that, we can teach them. And it is complicated stuff. Louisa Moats has been saying this to us for a long time. Reading is rocket science. It's not a simple thing because we're talking about rewiring the brain. The more we know about this, the more we know that Dr. Moats was completely correct, that it's very complicated. In order to learn to read and write, the brain has to create a new circuit, a physical, neurological synapse that connects language to the visual code. If our students are learning to read by sight, if we have a child who's blind, they're going to use a different code. They're going to use a tactile kinesthetic code, but it always involves a code. There has to be some symbolic representation of language, and we have to, the teaching, the instruction helps those brains build those connections. For the kids in that green zone at the top, those connections are built easily and effortlessly. For the kids at the bottom, there's a lot more work involved. Seidenberg also says, looking at the decades now of neurological and reading research, answering the question, how do students learn to read? He says, the answer is the same for all children. Of course, there's differences. We can look at that ladder and know that some kids are going to find it very easy, some are going to really struggle. But neurologically, the answer is the same for all children. There are differences. Cultural, economic, educational circumstances will affect students' progress, but what they need to learn does not change. So let's take a look at what they need to learn. Well, we can return to the simple view of reading, Scarborough's rope. What they need to learn is language. They need to have that in place. They need to build vocabulary and all of the background knowledge and all the aspects of semantics and syntax. They also need to learn a code. They need, and for most children, that's going to be, for all children, it's phonologically based, and then some kind of decoding process. Most of the time, we're going to teach kids to look at print, and then build a robust, large as possible set of sight words that they instantaneously recognize before they can even think about it. So taking the skills that need to be in place, phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, comprehension, to many of you, that list along the side there is going to be very familiar because that comes from the research of the review of research from the National Reading Panel, and in the subsequent 20-some years almost now, we know that those are the components that need to be in place. And what most state standards have done, this is from what Michigan has done, is take all those skills and put it on a timeline of when we should be introducing these skills and when we should basically, for most students, aim to be finished with them. So this is showing by 4th and 5th grade, if students are on track, they are ready to do very advanced phonemic awareness. They are decoding multisyllable words and looking at morphology, word study. They are building their fluency simply by reading connected text. They're building their vocabulary and their comprehension by doing lots of reading and lots of writing. That's the goal. This is the outcomes goal for our students. And many of our students with dyslexia are going to lag a little bit behind. I do find it so interesting. I remember very much reading this chapter in Seidenberg's book and about how children learn to read. And the statement of that the answer is the same for all children was, for me, with my background in reading, something I really had to grapple with. But looking at the research, I know it to be true. And what we talk about, what really works for all children, is that we're using the term these days, structured literacy, and that appears here on Nancy Young's infographic. She's saying for the students at the bottom that this structured literacy approach that we're going to be defining and talking about, it's essential for those students at the bottom. But we also know from research that when we use the structured literacy approaches with the students who basically can learn any way we teach them, but if we use structured literacy with those students, they are advantaged. They do even better than they would with just typical normal instruction. Again, returning to the Spell Talk listserv, I get a lot of good stuff off of there. Another frequent contributor is Steve Dykstra, who talks a lot about prevention, this notion that if we do this powerful instruction early enough, we don't even need to worry about who's dyslexic or not. Early in learning, there is no reason to separate dyslexic children from other kids who struggle to read for other reasons. They all need the same thing. We should intervene effectively, robustly with all of them. This is that idea of structured literacy. Effective, powerful instruction works for all kids. Let's not wait and worry about who becomes dyslexic. That early intervention is so important. Pamela Snow, another researcher, she's a researcher in Australia, writes a blog on reading occasionally. And this summer in August, she wrote this, that effective early intervention is like building better fences at the top of the cliff rather than parking ambulances at the bottom. Again, just a different way of saying the best, we need to intervene early. And she's saying the best early intervention is simply effective instruction. And if we do this for our children with dyslexia, Sally Shaywitz has used the term overcoming dyslexia. We can overcome it. Jack Fletcher and Nadine Gabb more recently even are using the word prevent. If we start early enough with these children who are showing some signs of speech kinds of concerns, language processing, auditory processing around phonemes, we can prevent dyslexia from happening. And that's because of our amazing brains that we're all born with a certain amount of neuroplasticity. And this Jack Fletcher has said what teachers are doing is brain surgery by instruction. And there are many, many studies like this, but this one was really beautifully designed and kind of easy to understand. This was a study done with 8 children with severe dyslexia, ranging in age from 7 to 17 years old, with a very intensive 2 hours a day over 8 weeks of structured literacy intervention focused on phonemic awareness. What the researchers did with these kids was 2 things at the beginning and 2 things at the end of the study. They started by scanning their brains to make sure to identify how they were processing their reading, and they also gave them just a standard reading test. And they found with this powerful instruction that their brains changed. But they also found that they became better readers just in 8 weeks by targeting the skill that they were struggling with. But with these children, they took scans of their brains before and after and saw what we now see in all of these studies. With powerful use of structured literacy, we are doing brain surgery. The brain changes. So just very quickly, the student on the left, the 15-year-old, the scan at the top is before the intervention, and you can see the student is doing their reading. They're trying to process reading and language in their right hemisphere, and 8 weeks later, with powerful instruction, that has switched over to the left hemisphere, and the same pattern with the student on the right. So let's talk about this powerful structured literacy that changes brains, that is necessary for the students at the bottom of the ladder, but improve the outcomes for the students at the top of the ladder. What we mean by structured literacy is basically this: instruction that is systematic, explicit, and involves the multi-modality aspects of instruction. It's what we've known for a very long time. 50 years we've been studying effective instruction. We've been studying these components: systematic, explicit, multi-modality, called it effective instruction. Structured literacy is a newer term that we're using, but we're talking about those component pieces. What do we mean by systematic instruction? It means there's a plan, basically, that somebody has carefully chosen a scope and sequence of skills, making sure all the necessary skills are there. They're presented in a logical order, so easier skills come before more difficult skills, that skills that could be confused by students, that B and D and P and Q, that those are not all introduced at the same time. Those are separated out. And the sequence allows building of the skills and practice of skills and frequent reviews. This is one of the distinguishing features of using structured literacy with the kids across the whole ladder. The difference is the kids at the top in the green are just going to fly through this. They're going to, practice a couple of times and they'll be ready. They will have mastered the skill or almost mastered the skill. The students at the bottom on the same exact skill with the same kind of instruction need much more practice. So the best designed, the best systematic instruction has lots of reviews built in so you can meet the needs of all of the students. Explicit instruction, 3 steps that, again, we've been studying this for many, many decades now. If we demonstrate to the student what it is we want them to do, we give them ample guided practice where you and I, the teacher and the student, practice together, and then ultimately give them a chance to practice independently. That's what we mean essentially by explicit instruction, and we know that it's effective. You may have heard the terms I do, we do, you do. With these 3 components. There are some of us who are looking at even newer research that suggests that it may be valuable, and very likely is valuable, to add a 4th step in here between guided practice and independent practice. And some of us refer to that as the collaborative step, or the y'all do. So I do it first as the teacher. I show you what I want. Guided practice, we do it together. So I can give you lots of feedback and corrections and encouragement. Once I think you're pretty firm on the skill, I can let you students work together, read, practice, whatever the skill is. But ultimately, there will be the opportunity to practice that skill completely as an individual, so I can see whether you've got it or you need more instruction. So pictures are helpful. This is what structured literacy explicit instruction can look like. I do, we do, a teacher is there with a group of students. The y'all do, the students, after they've had the independent, modeling, the demonstration, the guided practice, can practice together, and then ultimately the you do. And many people have a misunderstanding that explicit instruction is only something we do with very young children, or at least, we've not past 3rd grade. But I would beg to differ. We know that this kind of practice that allows small groups to work together, students to collaborate together, and students to work independently is very powerful from early grades. We've done this kind of grouping and instruction with 3-year-olds and taken it into high schools and college level. And in every single time, what we have found, students like it. They like the opportunity to be actively engaged. They like the opportunity to talk and discuss. They like the success of working with the teacher regularly so that they're learning the skills. Another component of structured literacy is multi-modality, and that is a fairly new word, and we're starting to use it to replace the term multisensory. It essentially means the same thing, but for a very long time there have been reading programs that were specifically designed for students with dyslexia that were systematically designed. They encouraged explicit instruction, but they also involved activities that included having students write in the air, or trace sandpaper letters, or trace letters, or write in shaving cream or something, or in a sandbox. What we've learned about from more sophisticated research is that those programs do work. We know that they've been very effective for students with dyslexia. But as we look at them more carefully and with more sophisticated research, we know that what made them work was the fact that they were systematically designed, and the kids were explicitly, and they were actively engaged in multi-modality, but it wasn't the multi-sensory. It wasn't writing in the air. It wasn't tracing the sandpaper letters. We don't need whipping cream or shaving cream, but what we do need to pay attention to is making sure that all the senses, all the modalities of the learner are engaged. Students do better if we have them hear the language they're going to be reading. They're seeing it if they have sight, or they're touching it if they are children with visual impairments. They're speaking it, and they have some opportunity to do kinesthetic work with it, but not air writing or tracing sandpaper letters. What we want them to do is engage in the task that what we're ultimately teaching them to do. So that would be writing the word, So let me give you an example of that. If we're going to do a multi-modality explicit instruction around the word bag. So this would be something we would do with our kindergarten students. So we're going to teach them the word bag. So quickly going through this, the teacher would start to activate their hearing and say, we are going to write the word bag. So they're hearing that word. Ask the students to engage, say bag. So we're hearing and speaking. And then we want to connect this word to meaning. What is a bag? I might have English learners in the class. It's also an opportunity to activate the language. Because remember, what reading is developing neural pathways that connect the symbols, here is B, A, G, with the language that's already in there. So let's activate that left hemisphere where the word bag should already be there. And if it's not, we have English learners, we can spend some time showing them this is a bag, this is a bag, different examples of bags, so they know what we're talking about. We can combine phonemic awareness activities or phonological awareness with kinesthetic activities by asking the students how many syllables are in bag. And for bag, one clap, but for other words, multi-syllable words, the kids can clap, or you may have seen students do this on their arm for information, getting a tactile sense of how many syllables in a word. Segmenting with the kinesthetic, of course, we would use that with explicit instruction, my turn, do it with me, your turn. How many sounds in bag? B, ag. Let's say the sounds in bag. We can hold up 3 fingers, popsicle sticks, or use sound boxes, Elkonin boxes. B, ag. We can show them visually that way. Continuing with now we've said the sounds. What word are we saying? B, ag. What's the word? Bag. We can connect now phonics, the auditory practices with phonics. Now we have to turn the light back on, take the blindfolds off the children. Activate the sound again. What sound do you hear at the beginning of bag? What's the last sound, the middle sound? And then what letter? Now we're bringing in the phonics. What letter makes the B sound? What letter makes the A and the G sound? Kinesthetic, pull out whiteboards or some kind of writing activity and have them actually pick up a pen, pencil, crayon, piece of chalk, whatever, and write a B and an A and a G. We want to be sure they do that correctly. So if they're just beginning learners, we could have that outline so they would just trace a B and trace an A. If they're a little bit more advanced with that, we can have cards available or write it on the overhead projector or the whiteboard to make sure they're doing it correctly, because practice, correct practice is what's going to deepen that learning. We connect decoding with the hearing and speaking. Read and say the word you wrote. So use your eyes to read it, say the word you wrote. Then we can bring in those advanced phonemic awareness skills by having them erase the G at the end of the word they wrote and now put a D in there, again with a model, and read the new word, which would be bad, of course. So let's wrap this up. We've covered a lot of things. We've covered them very quickly. We know now, we understand dyslexia is not a visual issue. It's not a spatial or orienting words. They're not flipping around on the page. Dyslexia varies from mild, very mild in some cases, to moderate to severe. Children are born with dyslexia. We do have to be careful about that, though, because we don't want to deny a child services because we can't identify any dyslexia in their family. We do not yet have a genetic test. Most of the researchers working in that field of genetics are saying we probably never will find the gene. It's not a single gene, but we do know that in most cases, students have inherited dyslexia from their parents and or grandparents. Dyslexia can affect speaking fluency because of the way the brain, that left hemisphere, the difficulties there with processing, storing, and accessing, as we saw from Noah's heart-rendering journal page in his journal, the severe, sometimes emotional consequences and lack of confidence. We want to start early because there's a lot of kids out there, perhaps up to 15%, perhaps even more, who are born with this challenge, and it's going to take that powerful instruction to make a difference as early as possible. Don't wait till we can label a student. If they're showing evidences of these things, simply bring in that structured literacy, bring in those materials that are systematically designed, allow for explicit instruction, lots of reviews, and engage the students across all their multi-modalities, because that's what's effective, and as early as possible, keep emphasizing that. So we're going to take everything we know, do the best we can to teach all of our students to succeed wherever they are on that reading ladder. Thank you so much for your time. I hope this has deepened or extended your information, your knowledge about dyslexia, and we look forward to sharing the handouts that we've developed with you as well. So be in touch with me if you want. I put my email address down there, as well as my Twitter connection. I do a lot of good, my Twitter feed is 100% devoted to reading issues, and if you're looking for some resources or discussion, I would love to see you on Twitter. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Dr. Hasbrouck. We appreciate your time today and joining us for this McGraw-Hill sponsored webinar. As she mentioned, we'll send handouts in the follow-up thank you email, and you can follow Dr. Hasbrouck on Twitter, and we'll see this recording to you as well. Thank you for your time today, and be well. Bye-bye.
Thank you.